fanning out across Capitol Hill who had all sorts of other atrocities to talk about. And when it went for a vote, it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. And Vladimir Putin went out of his mind. He went completely crazy. He's a guy who commits human rights abuses and then keeps his money in the West. And so he understood that, and he values money more than human life. And so he understood very clearly that his own fortune was potentially at risk. His first retaliation was to ban the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. And then his second retaliation was to make it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And the third thing he wanted to do was to come after me. And since then, I've been threatened with death, with kidnapping. I've been on the Interpol Red Notice list 8 times. They've applied for my extradition from the UK on multiple occasions. As I mentioned, they've sued me all over the world for all defamation, for all sorts of things. They made movies about me, etc. But neither the US or I were intimidated. And after the Magnitsky Act was passed, the senators who were my partners in this exercise, they said, if Putin is so upset by this, there's probably a lot of other dictators that should be upset as well, and we should make this the global Magnitsky Act. And in 2016, the global Magnitsky Act passed. I understood that America is a very powerful country, but a lot of countries, we need to have this not just in America, and most countries actually don't want to follow America when they do things. And so I needed to find another country to get the Magnitsky Act that would be followed. And so I must have made 40 trips to Ottawa, and like nobody makes trips to Ottawa. They don't see foreign people. And I got the Canadians to pass the Canadian Magnitsky Act unanimously in 2017. And then here in the UK, 2018, in the European Union, 2020, in Australia, 2021. In between all this, Norway, Iceland, Kosovo, Montenegro, the Channel Islands all have Magnitsky Acts. And a lot of people have been sanctioned all over the world, in Russia and various other places. And when Putin invaded Ukraine, there was no debate about at least one of the major policy responses, which is we use the template of freezing the individual's assets and banning their visas. And as you all know, thousands of people have been added to the sanctions list for invading Ukraine. The Magnitsky Act has been applied to the Chinese officials involved in the Uyghur genocide. It's been applied to Iranian officials involved in all the atrocities there, to Nicaraguans, to Venezuelans, to all sorts of bad actors. And it's a quite remarkable tool because instead of, it's like a modern cancer drug. The old cancer drugs nearly killed the patient to kill the cancer cells, and the new cancer drugs go after the cancer cells directly. And that's what the Magnitsky Act is. And I know how powerful it is because I know how angry anybody who gets put on the Magnitsky list is. Their financial lives effectively screech to a halt. No bank will do business with them. No company wants to do business with them. Their credit cards get canceled. It becomes a total disaster for them. And so in terms of addressing the question of the evening, does it advance the rule of law? I think the Magnitsky Act is a tremendous advancement of the rule of law because there is no law that deals with atrocities, murders, torture, etc., that are committed in a country that has no rule of law, where you don't have jurisdiction outside the country to prosecute those crimes. And in the Magnitsky case, there was no ability to prosecute anyone for what they did to Sergei Magnitsky. And with the Magnitsky Act, now there is. And so I'll never be able to recover from the guilt or the responsibility of Sergei Magnitsky effectively being killed in my service. But as Sir Geoffrey said, it's very rare to have a name on a law. And this, since they're not going to build any monuments for Sergei Magnitsky in Russia, which they should do, we now have a legal monument for Sergei Magnitsky in the Magnitsky Act.
Thank you very much, Bill, and I take it from the applause that you can hear us at the back. We have to be very careful about the acoustics in these buildings. They've been terrible over the years. Now, Bronwen Maddox, as you will have detected from what you were told about her career, starting indeed in the Financial Times, the Times, and then landing up eventually at Chatham House, has a world view. And it is to that worldview that we will turn, not because we don't want the optimism implied in what Bill's told us to be true, but we need not to get overexcited.
Geoffrey, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here. And while apparently questioners aren't allowed to pay tribute to those of us speaking, I can start, I think, under the rules, by paying tribute to what Bill has done. I remember years ago when I first met him, he said, "And they've killed my lawyer," and has not given up on trying to bring some kind of accountability in a country that does not respect the rule of law. And he deserves every award for bravery for a start on that. All the same, I'm uneasy on several points about what he said and about this being the new model, the new improved cancer drug, if you like. The older I get, the less I like metaphors as a point of argument. And I winced at that one. And I'll give you 3 reasons why. Let me just say first that in general, and while you can absolutely, as people in my line of work find, spend your life writing about whether sanctions work or not, there are many things to be said for them. They are an alternative between doing nothing and going immediately to war. And Bill's given us the South Africa example. I could give us as well the Iran nuclear weapons sanctions before Donald Trump jettisoned the deal that they brought about, as examples of where they really can help, and it is better than sending missiles around. They have many disadvantages, hence the noble stacks of PhDs on them. But we can have that other debate sometime. But I'm starting from thinking that they are a really useful tool. But I'd start as well by context, using that word from our title, by saying we're in a time when the rule of law really does need defending. It is up for grabs. You have some countries, and Russia is in this sense a rogue, saying it doesn't suit us to recognize it. You have others, I put China at top of this list, saying, well, we see the world really very, very differently. We interpret these rules differently. We are out to promote a really very different way of organizing relations between people and between countries. And you've got all kinds of other countries saying, well, make it worth our while to be interested in something as abstract as international law. All these rules, they might say, were written by the West, principally by the US. We went round the table. They were written to suit those countries. And if you really want us to care about them, then give us a seat at that table, and by the by, do other things that we care about as well. So we might care more about Ukraine if you do something about climate finance, and so on. And that is a really powerful, loud argument at the moment, which is itself a challenge to the layers, the sedimentary layers, such as they are, of international law. And so these are the reasons why I am uneasy about this sense that these very targeted sanctions on people, individuals, are the brave new way ahead. The first is that it gives more currency to this sense, this charge that the global north, if I can use that term, is out to write the rules to suit itself, and principally the US within that. because these sanctions don't work unless you have some economic heft behind them. And yes, other countries have come in behind the US, and one of those countries is the EU, so there's a lot of countries. But it is because of the US's economic heft that these have some bite, that Putin cannot do what he might want with his money. And it does give more charge, as I said, to this sense of that you're doing it because you don't like Putin. You don't like this following list of 173 people or 1,700 people or whatever. And brings me on to my second point, which is that it doesn't take you very far down that road to get a bit queasy about what this does do to the rule of law. Because for the rule of law, you have to show that it is fair, that it applies to all people equally, that there is a degree of transparency, that there is some kind of accountability, some kind of judging of whether it is fair. And it's very hard to do that with what is really a list of people who come out of an agreement between some senators and Bill Browder and some people in the European Commission or whatever. It is really very, very hard to show that there is process, that there is fairness, that this is not a political motivation, and very hard to use them in a way that does not accentuate this division that we are all feeling between the West, China and Russia, and then many other countries. And I think it is very, very hard to give that kind of assurance without some sense of oversight of them, and then you're into all kinds of mechanisms. They look, as they very much are, improvised and indeed very, very targeted. My third point is that it's very hard to know if they're effective or not. It's very hard to ask to know how the people experience them, the people who they are targeted against. They are easier to evade than if they were global. They are showy, but do they actually work? We have not yet seen many big changes of behavior. It's just that it obviously is inconvenient for these people, and it feels very good to those launching the sanctions against them. But do they actually work? So my reservation about all this, and as I said, starting from the point that sanctions are often a very good thing and a way of bringing about accountability. My reservation about this is that for all that it sounds like a form of accountability, it isn't. It's one that is improvised, an improvised and partial remedy for what is in fact a lack of accountability. But that is a bigger problem than this particular measure can answer. Thank you.
Well, that generates, I would have thought, in many of us, an obvious question for each side. For Bill, how do you meet this allegation of unfairness and satisfaction in the doer, but not result in the person being done by? But to Bronwen,
Good, thank you.
if sanctions are an alternative to the gun, however unfair or inefficient, do you have a better alternative?
Should I go?
Yeah.
Can I sit down?
You, whichever you like. Yeah. Providing people, can you see us sufficiently at the back? Because if not, we are all capable of still standing.
Well, why don't you stand up, because then I can stand up and I'm smaller than you are.
Okay, I'll stand up. I want to address the question you gave to Bronwen as well. There's a famous chess player, chess champion, chess grandmaster, Garry Kasparov, and he had a great quote when he was also working on the Magnitsky campaign, and he said, "Let's fight them in the banks instead of with tanks." And it's if you can fight with financial tools, go to war with financial tools, it's a lot less bloody and a lot less awful than with guns. But the real problem with the Magnitsky Act and with sanctions generally is that we passed this law, and it was used in the Magnitsky case, and it was used in those cases I mentioned to you, but it was used really sparingly. It was almost impossible to get someone sanctioned, and it still is. And sanctions have two possible functions. They can either be a deterrent, or they can be a punishment. And if you use them properly, they could be a very powerful deterrent. And so I actually believe that if we had used sanctions, let's say after Putin invaded Georgia, if we had sanctioned the top 50 oligarchs after he invaded Georgia, or top people in his regime, he might have thought, wow, these people in the West are serious. This costs us a lot and it's very painful. And he might not have done Crimea. Or if we had sanctioned after Crimea, he might not have done the full-scale invasion in February 2022. But we didn't. There was so much wanting to be seen to be doing something and not actually doing something that we did these tiny little sanctions here and there, but we never did them properly. And so it wasn't a deterrent. And now that he's launched this full-scale invasion, we've gone from a very limited sanctioning situation to probably 100 times greater sanction situation as a punishment. But the problem with the punishment is that Putin has already, when Putin decides to go forward, when he decided to invade, he can't now back down. And so the only way that we can win the war and stop the war with sanctions is to completely starve him of financial resources. And the sanctions have been very extreme. In addition to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of oligarch money being frozen, there's $300 billion of Russian central bank reserve frozen, there's Russian banks and companies have been cut off from the international capital markets, companies have left Russia, et cetera, all very powerful and painful sanctions for the Russian economy. But Russia continues to be able to sell oil to the tune of $500 million to $1 billion a day. And as long as they can do that, they're going to continue to have money, and they can continue to buy weapons, and they can continue to kill Ukrainians. And so we're in this terrible world where, because we didn't use sanctions properly, now we now have to use them much more, and we still haven't got the stomach to use them completely. And just one last point I wanted to make in response to what Bronwen said. The rule of law as it applies to sanctions was one of the big issues. So I must have gone to 25 different parliaments around the world to testify in favor of Magnitsky sanctions, and the obvious question was exactly this: how does this is an administrative punishment? What about what rights do the victims have, or the recipients, not the victims? The recipients have if they believe that they've been sanctioned improperly. And I said, I think you should build a mechanism into the sanctions program that every person who's put on a sanctions list has an opportunity to appeal their sanctions. And in every country that has Magnitsky sanctions, there is a procedure that you can go to. You can go to a court, and you can challenge the sanctions. I view sanctions in the same way as you would have an ex parte freezing order, which is that somebody can go in and freeze someone's assets, and then the assets stay frozen until somebody appeals. And I think that that's the same basic situation as legal remedy that people who have been sanctioned can use.
Can I, before you sit down, ask you one other question arising a bit from what Bronwen said about accountability and process? If it's the case that we believe open, full accountability, public accountability, is the way to deter a bad future, sanctions don't do that, do they? Because they only attack some of those who may bear responsibility, and the others who may bear greater responsibility but have no financial targets to hit can escape accountability altogether.
Well, I don't think that that's true. So it's very difficult to study what didn't happen because you sanctioned people. So you can only study what the immediate consequence of the sanctions. You can't say what actions haven't been taken by other people because they're afraid of sanctions. But I heard these amazing stories, and I even actually seen them in my own situation. So Mikhail Hordakovsky, I'm sure you all know him, the former head of UKOS who was in prison for 10 years. He told me, I met him shortly after he was released from prison and after the Magnitsky Act was passed. And he told me that the conditions in prison improved because the prison wardens didn't want to get put on the Magnitsky list. And I can tell you another example. The Russians have been, as I mentioned, have been chasing me around the world and hitting me with all sorts of legal claims. They've also been doing the same thing in Russia. I've now been sentenced twice in absentia to 18 years in prison. They really don't, and there's more cases going on. They've even accused me of killing Sergei Magnitsky, and there's a criminal case on that going on as we speak. And I have lawyers in Russia that in some cases, we don't actually engage in the judicial process, but they're involved in all this procedural stuff, so we know what's going on. And there was some complaint that our lawyer wanted to file, and he showed up in the summer, and there was like an interim judge there, and the interim judge said, no, just don't file this complaint with me. I don't want to be put on the Magnitsky list. The other guy's already on the list. You can file it with him when he gets back. And so, there's no way to scientifically prove or study what people don't do, what people are how people react to these sanctions in any kind of meaningful way. But what I can say is that everybody is terrified. Actually, one last story. After Mohammed bin Salman organized the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, there was mayhem and anger all over the world, and everybody wanted some type of consequence for him and everybody else around him. And there's this strange assumption in the world that I somehow control who gets put on these sanctions lists. And so I started getting these calls from these random Saudis or representatives of random Saudis desperately trying to make sure that they stayed off the sanctions list from this whole crime. And so, all this is very anecdotal, but what I can say is that this is something that really, really has a dampening effect on bad guys around the world. Now, does it stop all crimes? No. But does it stop some? Probably yes.
I'll accept anecdotes about deterrence as some evidence that it works, but it doesn't reassure me at all. And your final point, that people around the world think that you're somehow responsible for this list. I'm thinking of Mikado, if that's not, and that I have a little list, if that's not too. A reference for everyone. That itself is worrying, that people don't know the process. They think that you, going to Congress, get one of these lists started, and then it snowballs. So I think that that still hangs there, that worry about that. You asked, Geoffrey, what could be better? And I think we've got two really questions there. Putting sanctions against a state compared to sanctions against an individual. And we're talking here about sanctions against an individual. And it seems to me that sanctions against a state don't raise the problems that I have been suggesting to you. There were sanctions against South Africa as well as a civil society boycott as well. And you can more clearly point to the state as an organization that has done something, and it doesn't give, I think, the real worry about partisan, targeted action that taking cases against an individual does. I'm aware that there are exactly the same arguments at the moment about whether cases in Gaza should be brought to the ICJ or ICC, and the latter giving people some of the same queasiness sometimes about why you pick some individuals and not others. I think that is one big problem. I think I'll probably stop there. I mean, I was found much of what you said very, very interesting. Was scribbling all kinds of things, but I think it really comes back to that point of whether we can be comfortable in a sense of fairness, even if we can produce lots of anecdotes that people really, really don't like being sanctioned and so will to some extent get away from it. It doesn't, I think, really demonstrate that overall they work as well as sanctions against a state in getting that state to change direction. And I'm still bothered by the questions of fairness. So I'll stop there.
Can I ask
Yeah.
one supplementary
Yes.
question? If reparations ordered at or after Versailles against Germany are sanctions, did they not have some troubling outcomes on the view of some?
The reparations at Versailles did have troubling outcomes, but I think it is hard to call them sanctions. They were reparations in order to punish, but I think there is. Sanctions are aimed also at the future. They are to deter a course of behavior. The reparations, by definition, are to repair the damage that has been done, perhaps possibly including an element of punishment. But I think, yes, they look backwards, sanctions look forwards to try and shut off the behavior.
Well, thank you both very much. We're now going to have questions, but as you will recall, the students get their first 30 seconds. Sir, but you'll get a microphone brought to you. Oh, thanks very much, Bill. Your question.
It's better to have sanctions than do nothing. But when all these sanctions couldn't stop the death of Alexei Navalny or invasion of Ukraine or other wealthy Russians who are hiding their wealth in the Middle East now instead of the West, or other countries that are doing business with Russia right now instead of the West, like buying their oil, etc. So these sanctions are not being as effective as we intend them to be. So do you have a stronger alternative than these sanctions? Thanks.
So first of all, I think one of the reasons that Alexei Navalny survived until he did was because of the fear of sanctions. But the war started, and we rolled out just so many sanctions, so that by the time Putin was deciding whether to kill him or not, he said, "Well, what more can they do?" And he was right. We've already exhausted. I actually don't think that. I mean, there's more we can do, but for the most part, and we've seen the public policy response, which is they sanctioned a couple prison guards, and that was that. But in terms of what you're talking about, sanctions evasion, you're right. Russia is trying to run circles around us as far as sanctions evasion is concerned. And what I noticed when I was working on the sanctions stuff is for many years, even with Magnitsky Acts in place, as I said, the governments didn't want to use the Magnitsky Act that liberally. And so they had very small departments dealing with the sanctions. And so all of a sudden the war starts, and they have to increase sanctions by 100 times. And all of a sudden all these new people who've never done it before are all sitting in these sanctions offices trying to figure out how to do it. And so everybody's just making it up as they go along right now in the West. And so you have this, program to try to curtail Moscow's financial ability to fight the war. As you mentioned, India's buying Russian oil, China's buying Russian oil, Turkey is buying Russian oil. And then they're refining it in these countries and then sending it back to us, and we're buying their refined product. And so indirectly, all of our money is going back to Russia. And the moral of that story is all these hundreds of people who are now working in these departments are all coming to me and other people like me asking, well, how do we fix this? And the answer is they've got to get smarter. There's a learning curve of the Russians to evade sanctions, and there's a learning curve of our governments to continue to sanction them. And I mean, it's very interesting. After Russia was cut off from the SWIFT system, the Turkish banks wanted to set up an alternative, and all it took was one trip from the Office of financial and asset control in the US Treasury to have a quiet word with the Turkish central bank governor, and they all stopped the next day. And so it's an ongoing cat and mouse, whack-a-mole type of situation, and I think eventually with the sanctions will get tighter and more painful for Russia.
You know, I'm more optimistic than that as far as sanctions against the Russian state go. I think they are having quite a lot of effect for all the evasion. The fact that Putin then chooses to spend about a third of the economy on the war in Ukraine is something that will come home to him, but he's all kinds of things he can't get hold of. I think the country it's actually deterring at the moment may be China. Very hard to measure, but you hear a lot in talking to Chinese officials, their fear of, they call it weaponizing the dollar. If they did something the US really didn't like, at this point it would be very, very inconvenient for China, and that is putting it mildly, if China's reserves overseas were to be seized or frozen. And that is something that has given them pause for thought.
Another student question?
Setting aside the inherent tension with the cab rank rule, I'm interested to know whether you think the commercial bar is complicit in enabling this kind of strategic lawfare with Russian oligarchs. And if you look at the cases in the commercial court, not just now, but in the last 5-10 years, I think it paints a picture of almost modern Russian history. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that.
Thank you for asking the question. So I am the poster child of being the victim of slap lawsuits from the Russian government. In fact, there's a fund in Moscow set up by the Russian government to fund anybody who wants to take on any case against me in any foreign court, no matter how hopeless the case is. And so, for example, I was sued by Major Pavel Karpov. Some of you may have heard of the Karpov precedent for libel. So Major Pavel Karpov was a member of the Moscow Interior Ministry. He was involved in the financial crime that Sergei Magnitsky discovered and was killed over. And we made a little movie about him, a 10-minute YouTube movie about him here in the UK. And he came over here. The guy's on $15,000 a year salary, and he hired Olswang. And nobody seemed to want to ask the question, how is this guy with $15,000 a year affording all this fancy British legal help? And of course, the case was eventually kicked out. But he ran away with we had cost judgment of £650,000. And as soon as Olswang was paid, they disappeared. He ran away, and we never got our money. And they didn't have a single sort of twinge of remorse or guilt for representing this guy. And maybe there's a cab rank principle for barristers, although there isn't, because I went around looking for barristers, and it was hard to find one because a lot of them didn't want to work for me. But there's no cab rank principle for solicitors, and a lot of law firms were very happy to take on really dubious cases on behalf of Russians, going after me and going after journalists and going after other people who are trying to do the right thing. And so I think the legal profession here has a lot to answer for, and I think the legislation and enforcement needs to be strengthened so that it becomes financially unprofitable to do that kind of work, because people will continue to do it if there's profit in it for them.
Can I just pick up on that last point? We can keep rising every time if you want. I think that point about, I agree, and I've had many of those moments of looking at some member of the legal profession thinking, how do you sleep at night on precisely this domain? But I do think the question in the end comes down to government in terms of setting the rules about what it is permissible to do in Britain in all kinds of ways. And a mixture of naivety and greed and kind of innocence of British politicians led them to draw those lines very loosely for a long time.
Maybe one more student question, then I'll come to the hall. But in case there's a problem with the online viewers, I think there have been technical difficulties. I'm normally keen to take questions from those viewing online as well. So far there are none, or there's been a technical hitch. Is there another student question?
Maybe there's no one watching.
Yes, over there.
A student question over here. Thank you.
Good evening. This is a question primarily for Bronwen. Given the nature of conflicts themselves as heavily dependent on what perspective you're looking at them from, and regarding your points about fairness and uniformity, is there ever a type of sanction that's going to be fair and uniform that's not dependent on whose side you've taken based on your own interests and opinions?
It's a really, really good question. And the world is dividing.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, or I can repeat what I think is the question. Given that your view of a conflict depends really on which side of it you're on, is there any kind of sanction against a country in a conflict that could be said to be above the nature of that conflict, not on one side or the other? Is that right? It's a really good question. It goes to the heart of what Chatham House is working on at the moment, but the tussle over what remains of international order and indeed rule of law. I think but though there is a body of principles and laws that is there at the moment, and until it becomes entirely a free-for-all, I think we're in the business of then trying to shore that up. And yes, it is one that I think we can say unashamedly is on the side of Western values, or has those embedded in it. And that is what we are trying to uphold in terms of sanctions. But it goes beyond that. The principle of sovereignty that Ukraine is, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has twice offended, is one that goes well beyond countries that would identify themselves with the West and Western liberal values. If it really becomes a free-for-all and it's just zones arguing against each other for their values, then I think we have lost it. But that is precisely why we're having this debate, that we're still at a moment when there is something called international law, and indeed almost international order, and we can try and argue for that to be applied fairly, so that, I'm tangling over myself here, but so that it does have a degree of impartiality.
Anything to add?
No.
I just wanted to try to ask you if we can reconcile individual sanctions and state sanctions. And I worked for a while in Moscow for one of the international multilateral agencies, and when you were there actually, Bill. And I think what I took away from that experience was that there was a magic moment when the desert bloomed, and there was an opportunity, and I think to have reforms that would have made Russia a different country than it is today. Now, we're gone, and you perhaps more than most have witnessed that and what it means. And I think the structure of the Russian economy in particular, there are 3 state-owned enterprises which are essentially weaponized against the West, and they are Gazprom, they are Rosneft, and Transneft. I'm not talking about banks. So if we could, in any way, organize a form of sanctions, because this is the blood money that is going out of Russia, as you say, on illegal cargoes, transshipped to Asia and back to us. It's an absurd round robin. So is there a way, do you think, we can close the circle on this essentially?
This is the $300 billion question. So basically, as you say, round robin. So Russia sells $300 billion worth of oil. They buy equivalent amount of weapons and from North Korea and Iran, and spend money building munitions factories and all over the country. And then they use all those weapons to kill Ukrainians. So we supply the money to them indirectly to do all that. and then we're supplying the money to the Ukrainians to fight back. And that seems like a horribly inefficient way to go about this, and there's a lot of dead people as a result. And that's really horrible and makes no sense. So what's the simple way of fixing that? Well, in simple terms, it would be possible if we decided, if we decided technically that we wanted to embargo Russian oil, we could do that. We could basically make it impossible for anyone to buy Russian oil, and impossible for anyone to ship Russian oil, and impossible for anyone to insure the ships of Russian oil. We could really make it almost, not totally impossible, but pretty close to impossible. The problem is that Russia produces 10% of the world's oil. And if you were to cut off, in any market, if you were to take 10% of the supply away and you have the same demand, then what happens to the price? I know there's lawyers here, but this, in economic terms, the price goes up. And gasoline and oil is an important part of every economy. And we're all suffering from inflation. Every central bank governor is trying to subdue inflation. And it's a much bigger political problem than the war in Ukraine. And so there's no appetite to have the price of oil go up. And so what can you do about it? Well, we could throw a lot of sand into the engine of this machine. So we could, if we wanted to, and I just brought this up at the Treasury Select Committee, had hearings on this exact topic. And I said, here's the names of the refineries, and I just listed them off. I said, you can just say, if you process Russian oil, we'll put you under sanctions. And every one of these refineries does a lot of other stuff other than processing Russian oil, and I'm sure that they would not process any more Russian oil. So then you'd have all this oil sort of floating around out there. And what happens in those circumstances? Well, the price of that oil would go down, and maybe Russia would get $30 a barrel instead of $60, and cut off part of their oil revenue. But at the end of the day, you have this problem, which is that we have two competing set of objectives: inflation on one hand and stopping the war on the other hand, and that is a very daunting challenge.
A question from online. Could you please comment on the outcome of yesterday's EU elections and how it intertwines with the sanctions currently discussed? This refers, of course, to the right-wing shift.
I'm struggling to make the connection. I have lots of comment on the results of the EU elections, but can you spell it out for me? How?
This is a question
that is
online.
it. I'm going to hand it to you.
So the conventional wisdom is that Marine Le Pen was funded partially by a Czech bank owned by Russians. The AfD was caught taking money from Russians, and various other far-right parties were taking money from Russians, and therefore, if they become the governing parties of their country, which is not what happened yesterday. What happened yesterday is the European Parliament. But if those results in the European Parliament led to changes of government in Europe, then those countries would be less likely to keep the sanctions in place. That's the...
And to support Ukraine
Right.
and all this. But the right is several different things in Europe, at least. The right is complicated. Yes, you have those who are close to Russia, and I think you have the Hungarian government at the moment. But you have others who really have campaigned on migration and not liking it. You have others who are distinctly anti-green, and they don't all incline the same way on every issue. So I wouldn't rush to assume that. At some of them, and I would suspect that true of the right in this country, which is not far right compared to some of the European parties, but very much behind supporting Ukraine. So I don't think it's that neat. But Europe itself is finding it very hard to act as one group, and is developing more than it perhaps ever thought, a range of views, including on the founding values of Europe. And that is something that is helpful to Russia, as Russia has gleefully noted in the past 24 hours.
Ivan Lawrence, 30 seconds are yours.
The practicality and impracticality of sanctions is a very interesting subject, and you've touched on it and brought it to a head. But the real issue is, for our discussion, is surely this, that the Magnitsky rule is contrary to the rule of law. And it being contrary to the rule of law and something that governments can do to be effective against bad governments, isn't the matter that we have to consider and worry about for the future that authoritarian regimes like China, North Korea, might say, we don't need to follow the rule of law. All we need to do is to impose sanctions. And isn't that not a great worry for we lawyers?
Could you hear that at the back? Okay.
That the Magnitsky laws are against the rule of law, as they charge. And I must say, I'm very sympathetic to that and to the spectre that you raise, that China and Russia and many others might simply say, okay, we're going to make up sanctions of our own. And this is one of the reasons you've seen some hesitation over the freezing of Russian assets and giving them to Ukraine. So I think you're absolutely right to touch on it. And China is really quite explicit about challenging the international rule of law in all kinds of ways, particularly human rights law, but not just. Saying we don't see why it should apply to every country. It's not a universal law. And so this is my unease, that this kind of improvised measure, with the best will in the world, can support the other side because it undermines the rule of law that, going back to the question over here, that we are trying to uphold as extending between countries that really don't share very much, possibly at all.
I totally disagree with you. The reason why the Magnitsky Act exists is because you have countries that have no rule of law, that murder and torture and do all sorts of terrible things with impunity, and there's no consequence. There's no rules, there's no redress of any sort. And so what we've discovered was that almost all of these terrible crimes that are committed are done for financial reasons. And the people who commit those crimes like to keep their money in rule of law countries where they believe their money is safe. And so we've come up with a way to address the fact that there is no way you can go in front of any court to deal with these problems with an administrative measure, which is to say, if they have money here, you can freeze that money, and if they're really upset about you freezing the money, you can go to court because we do have rule of law here. And the best part of the whole thing is that we don't keep our money in China. And nobody keeps their money at Sberbank. So Russia did exactly that. We started sanctioning people, and then they started sanctioning people. And like, for example, I remember Preet Bharara, who was the prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. He had prosecuted various Russian gangsters, and so Russia put him on their counter-Magnitsky list. And he laughed because he doesn't go on vacation to Siberia and he doesn't keep his money at Sberbank. And so from a practicality standpoint, this is our great benefit because we have a financial system where these guys want to keep their money, and they don't have a financial system where we don't want to keep our money in their financial system, and so it's totally asymmetric. And so they're busy violating laws in their countries, thinking they can enjoy total impunity, and then we've created a consequence.
Right, but asymmetric doesn't mean fair. It means it gives the power to anything that the US is involved in, but that still doesn't make it fair and doesn't give them any framework to join if they were so inclined. And it's not just China and Russia we're talking about, it's all kinds of other countries.
Well,
You're also saying that it isn't always necessary to have a rule of law.
well, what I'm saying is that in the absence of any type of law, I mean, if we could set up a world court to punish people who do terrible crimes in countries that don't have a rule of law, that would be preferable to having administrative measures like the Magnitsky Act. But we're all living in a real world where we don't have an international world court that allows us to do that. And the United Nations was set up to deal with all sorts of terrible issues, and the United Nations is totally dysfunctional. And so now we have a situation where we do the best we can without all of these institutions and rules that we would love to have.
We'll take at least two more questions. One at the back and then the chap.
I can almost hear you, but
You should just shout.
that won't work for on. That won't work for on. Yeah.
Is this better? So this is for Ms. Maddox. In circumstances where we're told by Mr. Browder that there are mechanisms for appeal by these individuals, one might argue that actually on a rule of law, in terms of the rule of law, we're doing much better than Russia. But in a more general sense, would you not say that we are in a de facto Cold War with Russia? And therefore, to what extent do we want to attach weight to whether or not we are upholding the rule of law in relation to these sanctions, which, let's be honest, are meant to target our enemies?
I heard sort of 3 words out of 4, so I'm going to fill in the other ones as I like. Yeah, it began to echo quite a bit. Actually, listen, I can't do it. Can you summarize it? Yes.
In one sentence.
In one sentence. So we are in a Cold War with Russia, de facto. We need to be doing something, and an undue concern about the rule of law might inhibit us in a realistic sense. I'm not saying we should not be concerned about it, but I'm saying that where Russia is not concerned about it at all, we at least have, Mr. Browder says, appeal mechanisms, which at least in part address these raised.
Did those behind you hear it? I think so, yeah.
It was a really interesting question, and thank you for repeating it. I'm still uneasy about it. That is the kind of argument that you could see leading to Guantanamo, the expediency of the war on terror, and so on. Look, we need to do this in order to get back at the people who have committed an obvious outrage, as the world agreed 9/11 was, whatever else it then thought. I don't think that for me changes the position at all. We have, under existing rule of law, we have sanctions against Russia. I am more optimistic or confident than the picture that Bill has given about the effect that they're having on Russia. They are more than an inconvenience. Yes, it is managing to get round it and oil, but all kinds of things not. Yes, Iran is managing to trade oil, but that doesn't mean, grimly as we've seen, that it has access to airplane spare parts, as we saw with its helicopter accident, and has one of the highest rates of aircraft accidents in the world as a result of the sanctions. And the Iranian government is quite explicit about that. These things are immensely inconvenient, or more so for countries on the receiving end of them. But I think if we abandon the reasons for justifying why they're put in place, then we have lost claim to be justifying and standing up for the rule of law. And the US's authority to do that suffered enormously during the War on Terror.
I'll leave it at that.
Sorry.
Wait for the microphone. Sorry, I did say 2 questions. Have I now got to say 4? I don't know. I'll certainly say 1 more.
So there was the lady at the back. She was
sorry,
first.
We'll take this one first, and then you. Definitely you.
Apologies. My question is about political infiltration in Russia. Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy and other Berlusconi-linked parties up until recently received money from Russian Federation-backed individuals. I think also there were donations from Russian-owned companies to members of the Boris Johnson cabinet. And my question is, how can sanctions, if at all, get around this kind of political infiltration by the Russian Federation?
I can take that.
Sure, and I'll happily chip in as well. That's a good question.
In 2016, in the U.S. presidential elections, there was a whole effort organized actually by Yevgeny Prigozhin. He had an organization called Concord Management that basically had these trolls, like the Russian troll factory in St. Petersburg, which flooded Facebook at the time in the United States with all sorts of political ads to support the election of Donald Trump. And it was acknowledged by 16 different U.S. intelligence agencies. It was prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice. And and it was determined as fact that they did this. And then following the determination, the U.S. Congress passed a election interference law, which said that they were going to name or list out oligarchs who were close to Putin and then sanction them. And they sanctioned Oleg Deripaska, Viktor Vekselberg, and various other people and froze their money. And that's a pretty powerful thing to go after the people who were close to Putin who did this. And I think it was a very good thing to do, and we should be doing more of that. And if we did, I think that the level, it's like anything else. You reduce the amount of money available if you reduce the number of people who want to take that risk. And it was a pretty small, I think that, I don't know the thought process that these oligarchs were going through when they made the decision to support Putin and do whatever they were doing and to help him with these operations. But I imagine that it was probably a small favor that they were being asked to do, and they paid the ultimate financial price of being completely destroyed financially in the world where all their assets are frozen. And I can tell you that Oleg Deripaska and Viktor Vekselberg and others are not very happy people.
I think you raise a really interesting question, but I'm not sure sanctions are the answer to it at all. You call it an infiltration, you could say recruitment, even seduction of, you say, countries like Hungary. And the European Union does not have an answer what to do about Hungary, or a country like Hungary, a small country which decides to use its veto under the European Union rules to argue for all kinds of things in its self-interest, some of those destructive to the European Union and convenient for Russia. We had the foreign minister of Hungary on the platform at Chatham House, deeply charming and saying, yes, we're going to use the veto for everything, and we don't believe in the founding values of the European Union. And yes, we're about to take the presidency and so on. And so I think, there is a real question that the European Union will have to face about whether it is tougher about the sanctions or the penalties for going against its own rules. And it's begun to get a bit tougher, beginning to realize, I think, the existential threat that this direct challenge poses. You raise also the question about disinformation and so on, which is really extensive. And I was struck in the recent debates in the US Congress about Ukraine that there were more than a few who seemed to have taken the Russian line that, look, Ukraine is really a pretty terrible place and it's doing all these terrible things, and and therefore we shouldn't support it. And that has to be with better information, and we are moving into an era of information wars where I fear that everyone's going to have to start from the position of believing nothing rather than believing most things. But I think that, as I said, I don't think the things you've described are well addressed by sanctions, but they are real and need to be counted in different and specific ways themselves.
Last question.
Hi. I would be interested whether you consider that our current approach to sanctions bears too much of a risk of creating an us versus them mentality, and where, if you could ever envisage a point where we're just imposing too many sanctions, that we lose sight of the reason why we're actually imposing the sanctions for just imposing them.
Well, so the bad guys are all saying that by doing all these sanctions, you're ruining your reserve currency status. That why would anyone want to keep their money in dollars or sterling or euros if they believe that that money can be frozen or confiscated or whatever. And then the question becomes, okay, if they're so worried about that, which may be justified in the case of Russia or China, where else are they going to keep their money? Are they going to stop holding euro accounts and hold Iranian rials or Argentine pesos? I don't think so. The reason why reserve currencies exist is because they're liquid currencies in stable economies, and as a result, that's where all trade goes on, that's where all value is stored. And as much as these guys may not like it, well, nothing else you can do. I mean, and cryptocurrencies aren't going to work, and so at the end of the day, I think that we can do more sanctioning, as much sanctioning as we want. The currencies of our countries, where, by the way, 99.9% of the money is perfectly safe and normal and unsanctioned, because that's how world trade goes on. But if people do bad stuff, they should expect that there's going to be a consequence, and they should expect that their money is at risk. And it's a hell of a lot better, as I started the whole conversation, to fight them in the banks than to fight them with tanks.
On that we are agreed. Of all the things that seem to have changed in the world, one has not, which is that the dollar remains the dollar as this reserve currency with no real competitor. That may change, and again, all kinds of analysis has been written on it. At some point, facts about the US are going to become real, including the amount of debt it piles up, and possibly its dysfunctional politics, if that goes on, beginning to compromise its growth, and then the world thinks again about whether to hold dollars. That isn't the case at the moment, as Bill has described absolutely rightly, and so at the moment there is no alternative. But there could be some point, and we can keep on doing sanctions while that is the case. But even so, that is the expedient answer. I still worry that we do it just because we can, and we, in this case, has to mean the US, because sanctions are really most effective when the US is involved, and they're not very effective if other countries try to do it, even if the US is glad of some support and others. I think we risk the standing of the rule of law, because we don't really have the reasons for why we're doing it other than that we can. And that is really what has bothered me about this.
We could hardly have had a better elucidation, clarification of the issues. It's not possible to sum up what's been said, save perhaps to observe that in the truly desperate times in which we live, if it were not for sanctions we would be turning even more to such legal systems as exist, the International Criminal Court, hoping that those activities which are rule of law systems might save us from where we are going. On the other hand, thousands, millions of people get fed into war machines because of political failure. And we don't want it to happen too much longer, because it's foolish to say never again. The Treasurer may in due course invite you to exercise your hands in the way for which they were intended on events like this, but before he does, can I just say a couple of things? First, immense thanks to Henrietta Amodio for making these events possible. Without her, they would not happen. Second, thanks to the library for those of you who may want a reading list of further material. You can find it quite easily. Third, the next and last event this year in this series will, I think, cover one of the two conflicts about which we have been concerned in particular today, and I look forward perhaps to seeing many of you here then, although I think I will be in the audience and not moderating. Treasurer.
That has surely been one of the most stimulating discussions, debates, exchange of thoughts that we've had in this inn in recent times, and even that by the high standards of this series. It has thrown up so many thoughts in my own mind about it, and I'm sure, looking around and having heard the questions, many others have done so. I'm tempted to mention one or two of them, but I'm not going to, because we have had a good long session. But thank you indeed to our speakers for taking on this task, for fielding all the questions that they have helping us take this all as seriously as it needs to be done. Thank you all. May we join in applause.